Hello and welcome to the Supernatural Track here at Continual. I'm your host, Gail Martin, and tonight we are talking about how a horror show became a comfort show and what we can learn from Supernatural for handling our own personal apocalypses. Apocalypses? I'm not sure that's meant to have a plural since it's sort of supposed to be kind of a one and done, but that's our world. So before we dive into that, let's let our wonderful panelists introduce themselves, starting with Michelle.
My name is Michelle Crowley. I am a professor of communication studies and pop culture at Gateway Community and Technical College in Northern Kentucky.
All right, Travis.
Hi, I'm Travis Adams. I'm a readjustment counselor. I specialize in working with veterans with PTSD from combat, similar to stuff that you see Sam and Dean dealing with.
All right, Kaela.
Hi, I'm Kaela Joseph. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist out of the San Francisco Bay Area. I do lots of different things in program management, LGBTQ plus psychology, and also study fandoms.
And I'm Gail Martin, and Morgan Bryce. Is Gail write epic and urban fantasy? Is Morgan write urban fantasy, male paranormal romance? But all my books are ones where Sam and Dean could walk into and feel right at home. So let's talk about this kind of oxymoron on how this little horror show became the comfort show that people watch over and over and over again. Michelle, start us off.
Well, I think one of the big draws of the little horror show that could is the fact that it does talk about a lot of very realistic issues and a lot of realistic trauma that their audience is going to be going through, but it does so in a way that is different from other maybe horror genre shows or even movies, because we have the longevity of the storyline. We have the ability to see the story from beginning to end, and we also, if we're going off with other like typical horror shows or movies, we don't have a lot of those tropes that we typically see. So we don't have the the first kill or the final girl or anything like that. We have more of a, I guess we can have more of a connection with these characters because we don't know who's going to survive, who is actually the bad one, who, and so it mirrors our own personal experience in a lot of ways, where other shows like, I'm blanking on other like horror shows. The only one I can think of is Dexter, but I've never seen Dexter, so I can't really compare that one. But it's got a lot of I think the things that we love about horror, the horror genre, because there's a whole lot of psychology as to why we love the horror genre. And I'm sure, Kaela, I'm sure you've looked into some of this as well. And so we get the good parts, and we also get to skip a lot of the bad parts.
Okay, Travis?
Yeah, I think with how well the writing is, how well the actors play, how you get to like really get to know who everybody is. Like Michelle said, you get to see from beginning to end, which is really cool. They do a lot of stuff with the flashbacks, so you get to see them as kids, even though we meet them when they're in their mid-20s. I think that it does give us comfort because it's something that, when you've watched it, you want to rewatch it and see what you've missed. And it's so heartwarming. I think the whole through line of the show is family, right? So I think that all of us, whether it's picked family, chosen family, or born into family, we can all relate to that in various ways. I've had some of my clients watch it just for that undertone, and they've been able to kind of shift their belief on what family is because of Supernatural.
Okay, Kaela.
I think there's a trifecta that happens with Supernatural that you don't see in a lot of media. So you have the horror piece, and there is that psychology of, horror is appealing as a comfort sometimes because it is otherworldly. It is a way to look at problems and problem solving in a way that is so big and above and beyond horrific that it sometimes, I think, makes the day-to-day of the horrific things that we all go through a little bit easier to manage and a little bit easier to map onto. You then have the fact that it spans so many seasons, as Travis was alluding to. You have so much complete story to look at. And there's a lot of shows that shortcut as they go along, where the characters don't really grow, especially interpersonally. There's the like exit stage left conflict where somebody starts fighting and they just walk away and there's no resolution whatsoever. And I think because of the really fantastic writing on the show and fantastic acting on the show, you don't really get that. You do get resolution to the conflicts, and you don't recycle old conflicts. It's actually growth like you would have in a real interpersonal relationship. And then the third part of the trifecta is the fandom and how dedicated this fandom is, and the fact that there is this ability to then talk amongst the fandom and have shorthand for your own experience mapping onto these characters. So for example, I have friends who watch the show that I love talking with them when I'm in a lot of distress, because I can use shorthand for the show and talk in metaphor about that. And it's easier than trying to explain exactly what's going on in my own brain sometimes.
I think one of the things that strikes me coming at it as a writer is that it's kind of axiomatic that part of writing horror, one of the underlying themes in a horror novel is helplessness. That sense of helplessness builds and builds and builds, and that's part of the tension that goes into meeting the monster, finding out what's in the basement, confronting the thing in the woods, is that the protagonist is helpless. And these guys, you know, Sam and Dean, they make mistakes. They're human, but they're not helpless. Even at their worst, they're not helpless. And I think that is very empowering, because it's one thing to face monsters and be at a disadvantage when you don't have a plan B, you aren't armed, you aren't trained, you don't know how to deal with this, you're overwhelmed. And it's another thing to go in on nearly equal footing as warriors who know what they're doing most of the time and have experience and have the skills to handle it. And I think that makes even the end of the world feel much less terrifying when we face it with the boys, because even in facing down Chuck at the end, they had a plan. They had some tricks up their sleeve. They weren't just, oh, well, God's out to get us, I guess we need to lay down and die. And I think that is a huge difference between a horror themed show and a show or a movie or a book that is truly horror, because we have that hope and that competence and that ability. One of the things that, well, most of the time apocalypse is a singular noun, because it's supposed to be kind of one and done. But on Supernatural, we have many apocalypses, large, small, and somewhat personal. What people face all kinds of major challenges, not just in reading at the news and going, oh, nope, I'm noping out of this, and also in their personal lives. What are some of the things that we can learn from the way Sam and Dean and their allies face down their own apocalypses? Michelle?
I think one way that we see this, and kind of piggybacking off what Kaela said before, is the character development, not just in the personal growth, but also the interpersonal growth. And so from the very beginning, we see Sam and Dean, they have their interpersonal issues, and they say, my brother is the most important person in the world, and then we find them keeping secrets from each other left and right. And as we progress throughout the many seasons, we see that they are learning not only the error of their own ways and doing their own personal growth, but seeing truly the, I guess, benefit in interpersonal communication development. And so towards the end of the series, we have them keeping, I can't say no secrets, but less secrets from each other, and cluing each other in when they really need that, information. And that's something that I think we can take away from the show for ourselves, is because as we experience our lives and as we experience different apocalypses in our own world, we can kind of take those lessons, and not only for ourselves, but also how we interact with others and improve our own interpersonal skills in that way.
Okay, Travis?
I think that one of the things that really resonates with me with the show is the amount of resiliency that we see from both of the brothers. I mean, most of the cast too, right? They're always able to bounce back. And I love resiliency. And I think there's a downside to resiliency that a lot of people don't have, that we see Sam and Dean do, is that they bounce back from lows, but they also learn from them, which a lot of people, they just like, oh, well, I'm resilient. I just keep bouncing back. But if you're not learning from these lessons, how much are you really gaining? And we get to see that. So like Michelle said, they keep less secrets from each other. They can be better off by season 5 not having any secrets, but they're learning. They're guys. But there's this kind of continued message that they always present, and that they reflect on things. They use lessons learned earlier in the series, later on in the series. So you really get to see these actors as people, that do care, that do have heart, that do love, and that can learn. And I love that part. And that's how they keep bouncing back, whether it's dealing with Lucifer for the first 5 seasons or building up to that, and then the new ones at the end of every other season.
Okay. Kaela?
And I think part of what we're talking about is them developing what we call psychological flexibility. So the ability to look at a problem, and rather than just get stuck and be very rigid in your thinking about it, you look at the problem and you try to find other ways around the problem or other ways through the problem. And we see that over and over again. The tension in a show that can have up to 20 something episodes is that you're going to have a plan that doesn't fail. In fact, they make jokes about that often, that Winchester plans often fail. And they have to recoup, and they have to figure out how to move forward from that. And I think that there's a really nice allegory there for how we can more effectively problem solve. And you mentioned like the media piece. As you were talking about that, I was thinking about how they go through newspapers and online stories and look for what's their stuff. And one of the things that I teach clients, one of the things that I do for myself, is with how awful news media especially can be these days, looking for, well, what's your stuff? What's the stuff that you need to pay attention to? And what's the stuff that you can maybe put on the back burner because that's just not important right now? At least not for you. You can't personally affect anything about it.
And I think that brings up a really good point, in that Sam and Dean are focused on the kinds of problems they have the skills to solve. They're not trying to broker peace between countries. They're not trying to end nuclear war. They're not trying to cure any non-demonic form of plague or illness. They kind of stick to their lane of what they're good at. And that means that if you're going through all of that deluge of information in the news, that makes it a lot easier to sort out the stuff that isn't in your wheelhouse. Yep, sad, hope somebody can handle this, wish it would go away. Can't personally do that, but look, there's something over here. I can go shoot this Wendigo. Looks like zombies to me. I can handle that. And I think that can help turn the everyday sense of apocalypse, where it's just too much, too everything, into, okay, I've got this little narrow sliver that I can actually do something about. I'm going to go shoot my werewolf for today. And then I'm done. I don't have to worry about the rest of it. They don't stay up all night worried about nuclear war. They got their werewolf. And I think that's also the flexibility you're talking about is a big difference between Sam and Dean and John, and was often, a point of friction because John didn't really learn from what he had done before, other than in tactical ways. But in terms of picking up, like the boys did with, hey, maybe not all vampires are evil. Maybe werewolves could coexist. Maybe we don't have to kill the monsters that aren't hurting people. John never got to that point of flexibility. And not only did he seem much less happy because of that, but it made him not as good of a hunter. I think Sam and Dean became better hunters because they had that flexibility in being able to learn from what they'd done before. So from the many, many times that the boys faced down apocalypses of all kinds, personal and worldwide, what were some of the skills that let them succeed? We've talked about flexibility, but certainly there were others. Michelle?
Cutting the head off really helps. And not only just, in the literal sense, but kind of along the lines of the choosing, when Sam and Dean chose their battles. It reminds me of that meme where it's like, choose your battles. Nope, put some of those battles back. Nope, put more of those battles back. And I think that's another thing that we see along cutting off the head. We're not dealing with the worldwide plagues. We're not dealing with nuclear war. We're just dealing with the small, the here and the now. And of course, within the storyline of the show, there are the long running plot lines and such. But for the most part, I think that's one of the reasons that I personally love the Monster of the Week episodes. And even though they became fewer and fewer as the seasons went along, they were still my favorite because it was a kind of a, here's the problem, we wrap it up, it's done, we move on. And I wish that was something that I could do more in my life, where it's, I deal with one problem at a time, finish it, and then move on. And unlike Sam and Dean, I'm still working on that. But not really sure where I was going with that. But yeah, cut the head off.
Okay. And I just got that scene with Gordon and the bandsaw. So yes, make it a clean cut. Travis.
Yeah, when Dean and Sam started learning about the other crew going after like the alphas and trying to get rid of all monsters, and they talk about like the British men of letters and going after all monsters, and they're still focused on like the helping the individuals. And that's where I think it really was the most like intrinsic value of theirs, was being able to save lives. Like getting rid of monsters was nice, but they wanted to save lives. They wanted to be those people that can be counted on to take care of others. That's what they really needed in this whole journey that we see them go through. Sam kind of buys into the whole British men of letters thing about not having any monsters, but Dean would get bored in a world without monsters, so he's all about it. But yeah, I think that's it's all about those individuals and traveling the country and taking those back roads and meeting people and getting to build relationships. And you learn, kind of touching on what we were talking about before too, as they pick up new friends, family members, Charlie, things like that. They get to learn more skills, and they become wider or broader approaches. They're not so singular focused, which I also really liked.
Well, yeah, and you mentioned the men of letters. Sam and Dean had saved Magda, and then Ketch follows her and kills her. How does that help anything? He was still seeing her rigidly as a monster instead of a victim. And his worldview was so rigid, he couldn't expand that. He couldn't redefine that to see that this was somebody who had been put in an extreme situation and dealt the best they could. So yeah, there's that flexibility piece comes back into this to be able to see and learn and adjust. Kaela?
Well, and I think that they also do a fantastic job of imparting some of that flexibility onto others. I mean, just about everybody that they encounter who was once a villain becomes at least somewhat of an ally. There's a few that don't, like Abaddon, for example, but most of them at some point have some kind of allyship with them. And I think that they apply that flexibility to also expanding their network as the problems get bigger. So when it's not Monster of the Week, they start to employ a lot of the rest of their network, and to great effect. As the problems get bigger, their social circle also gets bigger. It often, unfortunately, because it is a horror show, also shrinks very tragically at different times in the show. But by the end, you have so many other characters who are just as integral to the final plot lines as the brothers are. And I think that the show did a really wonderful job of keeping it very central to these main characters who we've come to attach to and see ourselves in, while also making it clear that, hey, you don't actually have to fight your battles completely alone. There is actually a lot of value in having people around who can support you in that.
I think that together with all those is that they never stopped learning and researching and looking for new approaches. They didn't go, well, we now know everything about dealing with vampires. Well, we could write the book on hunting ghosts. They landed in this treasure trove of the British Men of Letters bunker. And in my mind, they also picked up Cuthbert Sinclair's bunker, and they picked up that bunker with the tentacle monster. And I think they probably backed up a U-Haul and cleaned them out and kept them as just in case bolt holes, but took all the good stuff back with them. And this constant learning to say, well, okay, nobody died, but could we have done that better? Is there a way that maybe nobody dies and nobody gets hurt? Or that maybe we don't burn the place down. Maybe there's still a better way to do this, even though that was pretty good. And I think that is another form of flexibility, not getting to the point where you think you know everything, and being willing to learn and adjust, even if you're already good at something, because there might still be a better way to do it. I want to talk about those allies because it's never fun hitting an apocalypse, but it's a lot easier if you have friends to go through it with. So how did they, what kind of growth did we see with them in terms of friends and allies? And how does that affect their and our ability to kind of weather the storms? Michelle?
I think one ally that I would like to focus on specifically is Rowena. And so in my mind, Rowena took a little bit longer than some of the other allies to come over onto the boys' side because she had her own agenda. She had her own, I guess, lack of psychological flexibility in the situation, because she was very focused on getting the grimoire. She was very focused on getting those chains off of her and getting all of her powers back. And it took more of her relationship with Crowley to, kind of developing that. And there's that scene where they're in the bus station where you kind of see their mother-son sort of relationship. And it really isn't until that point that we see more of that interpersonal conflict management growth within Rowena. And by the time we see her, like starting, I think it was season 14, where she's tangoing with someone and lighting the other woman on fire, and it isn't until almost that point that we see her as that ally. And so it really took, what was that, 4, almost 5 seasons. I think she came in season 9, season 10. And so it really took a long time, but she had to get through her own battles first. She had to get all her own powers back. She had to, I guess, accomplish her own agenda before she could then look beyond that particular relationship with the boys and start seeing them more as an ally.
Okay, Travis?
I think that for a lot of the allies, unfortunately, they have to go through their own trauma or their own traumatic experience to even be on the boys' radar, or nearing a traumatic experience. Like Charlie got introduced just because of her connection to Dick Roman and where she was, and then she has lots of traumas on after that. Crowley looking for his own kind of agenda, right? They same with Rowena, but even Bobby, it wasn't until his wife died that he had to kill her that he wasn't into the hunting lifestyle. So looking at how the support is when they're stronger together. And you see this even with just Sam and Dean. When they go separate ways, they're never as good. They're never as strong. They're never as competent. When one starts to get hopeless, right? You mentioned hope at the beginning, Gail. Like in season 15, Dean's like, screw it, I'm just gonna drink. It's God. We can't do anything. And Sam's like, no, I'm not falling for that. And he gets him back on track. And I think that's what we can do as having connections, relationships, friends. I tell a lot of people that I work with that really like everything we're doing is all about connection. Everything in when I talk about mental health, when I talk about my own personal goals, it's all about having relationships and connections. And the more we have, the stronger we become, the healthier we become. We can challenge each other, we can help each other. So having these associates, the hunters adjacent, whatever it looks like, I think really inspires Dean and Sam that they're not alone too.
Okay. Kaela?
Something else that's really important about that is their chosen family. So, there are many of us who, for various different reasons, have to create our own families. There's this beautiful theme throughout the show: a family doesn't end with blood. And I think that for a lot of fans who find this to be a comfort show, that's been very true for us in building our own networks. And so having people that you choose doesn't mean that you don't have the same kind of conflicts that family has, but it means that you get to navigate those conflicts in a way that harkens back to that flexibility. You can choose people who can manage that conflict and who will be with you there through that conflict. I think about Cass, for example, as a character that's in their lives for most of the series. They have a lot of really big, earth-shattering, apocalyptic type falling outs with Cass, many of which are caused directly by relational and communication issues, and yet they don't actually give up on one another. Even in like these big moments of even trying to give up on one another, they eventually come back together and eventually do find ways to support one another again. And I think that there's a really wonderful message in there about setting boundaries in those relationships that we do need to kind of go through our own personal apocalypses, while also not being so rigid in that limit setting and that boundary setting that we aren't willing to compromise and meet folks where they're at. And there is just a really nice way throughout the show. I think a lot of the characters have that sort of post-traumatic growth with one another. In addition to like learning new fighting skills, they're also learning how do we communicate with each other better and not have this sort of thing happen again.
Yeah, I think it's really important that the show showed us that Sam and Dean had significant issues with John, but then Bobby emerged as a father figure. They were not in tune with Mary. Mary was not what they hoped for and not what they needed. But they had Jody. And so they were able to find the relationships and the nurturing relationships that they needed, even when that wasn't the birth family, that wasn't who it was supposed to be. They were able to get what they needed. And that is such a valuable lesson when, the roll of the dice doesn't give you what you need genetically. knowing that it's possible to get those needs met by other people that you find that are more in sync and more in tune with you, and have a healthier approach to what lies ahead of you. Now, as far as coping mechanisms go, aside from, Jim, Jack, and Jose, and a girl in a Zorro mask, what are some of the better coping mechanisms that we see with Sam and Dean? And of course, alcoholism aside, some of the ones we might want to avoid. Michelle?
I think one of the coping mechanisms that we see Sam use is kind of relating back to what we were talking about earlier, is that he's always learning and that he always is looking for the next answer, or returning to the lore. Yes, we know how to kill every vampire, but what about these werepires? So what about the next monsters? So we see Sam when he gets, I guess, to the point where he would be drinking if he was more of an alcoholic. Then we see him going into the books, and obviously the boys do benefit from that, because hey, so get this, here's something I found, is always his kind of go-to thing. But I think another on the negative side of things, when we see the boys distancing themselves from each other, that is, I think, the number one downside that they had to overcome throughout the series, was that when things get bad, you can't just split. It's better to stay and fight. It's better to stay and work through the issues, because if you run once, you're just going to keep running for the rest of your life.
Yeah, good point. Travis?
I think that's a great one, Michelle, with Sam learning. I like the mindfulness approach, right? So just being kind of present centered. So you can use this if you're talking about like the pool, but they're also hustling for money and usually in drinking. But also the episodes where they talk about just like laying on top of a baby and looking at the stars. Sam going for a run just kind of clears his head. All those things I think are really healthy coping techniques too. Because sometimes we do need to get out of our head. We just need to be just present to let our anxieties fall off to get a clearer picture. So I really, really like that. The maladaptive, right? Those unhealthy, the helpful but unhealthy things. It's sometimes just the anger and violence, and really it's the aggression piece. Like when John dies and Dean is repairing baby, and then he just beats the hell out of that back quarter panel because he's just hurting so much and doesn't know anything else. When he breaks the glass of the hospital because he punches it, he has all this raw emotion that he doesn't know how to direct it. And it's the aggression piece that is helpful at times. That's why it's there, right? If you're a combat guy, if you're a fighter, if you're a hunter, you need that type of aggression, but knowing a time and a place. And I think that's where the maladaptive piece comes in. It's not helpful all the time in all the places.
Kaela?
I think that piece about time and place is so important, because I tend to talk with folks less about what's healthy, unhealthy, and more in that same language that you're using, Travis, of what's helpful and unhelpful, and what's helpful and unhelpful in different contexts. So even the drinking, for example, there's moments where that drinking is very social, like when they are sitting around as a family having a dinner and a conversation, or when Dean and Cass are sitting in the library having a chat about how they actually have a win for once, and they actually maybe have a way to defeat God, versus towards the end when Dean's using a bottle of Jack as a pillow. Less helpful in that situation. So I think, looking at what we were talking about earlier with growth, part of it is how over time they start to figure out what coping skills are healthy for them or helpful for them versus not, and in what context. So even like the getting away from one another. certainly getting away from one another in a big screaming match where they have walked away entirely and disowned one another does not work well. But there's a few times that Sam tells Dean, hey, I need space. I need you to actually back off. That is a much more helpful coping skill. It's the same coping skill as before, but it's a version of that coping skill that doesn't leave Dean feeling abandoned and gives them an opportunity to come back together while also giving Sam the autonomy he needs.
Yeah, I think that Sam's research is a tremendous coping skill. I mean, I know it's one that I do when I'm overwhelmed with something where I've got a sudden challenge, whether it's a home repair or a medical issue. I'm going to read everything I possibly can on it because that is empowering. That then means that I can talk to an expert with an idea of what's going on, and I'm not completely at a loss. And I'm not going to suddenly become an expert, but I can now have a reasonable conversation with an expert and explore the possibilities without being completely clueless. And so, and that's without having to figure out how to put down, you know, a 3,000-year-old vengeful ghost. So I think Sam's research is not only practical, but it is also grounding and empowering, and provides real benefit. For Dean, you know, we don't think of Dean having hobbies, but loving baby and taking care of the car and the guns really count as a hobby for anybody else. So when he goes to the garage and when he spiffs up baby and when he takes all the car maintenance or when he just sits down and cleans all of the guns, there's something very grounding in that. That's a mechanical, that's a doing instead of thinking kind of thing. And whether you're knitting or you're cleaning the guns, it's a way to get your mind off obsessing about what the problem is. And once you quit obsessing, somehow, once you ease up and you don't have that vice grip on it, you start getting other ideas and you start seeing other possibilities. And I think both of them, even though Dean would probably never call baby a hobby, I think it fills that role of a useful distraction and one that he can accept that distraction as not wasteful. Hey, I'm not wasting time. I'm doing something that needs to be done, but it's an interruption to the endless cycle of what if. And once you break that cycle, then, you know, you start to get some fresh air and you can get some new insights.
You know, I think that there's a lot there in what you're saying. I mean, when we see Dean go to heaven, you know, what's he doing? He's driving baby. That's his happy place. That is where he is smiling and content with the world. Um, when I talk to my clients, one thing I like to do is like, let's say if you don't have a problem with it, I don't have a problem with it. But if you or someone in your life has a problem with it, we need to look at it. So if you're cleaning your guns too much, right? Like too much of anything can be bad. Then let's just take a look at it. It doesn't have to change, but let's look at it. Because yeah, anything can be beneficial, but it's when it becomes unhealthy, unsafe, completely avoidant, right? That's another thing is like maybe I'm avoiding too much and that's bad, even though it's a healthy thing I'm doing.
Well, and it's funny that we think of Dean as not having hobbies because we often attribute like the nerdiness to Sam. Dean watches an enormous amount of TV and movies. Dean quotes and seems to in the background watch TV much more like fans of Supernatural watch TV. And you know, we started this talking about why this show and why a horror show, why are these things that act as comforts? And Dean describes that in his own fandom, where he talks about liking the slasher franchise and their universe because it's predictable. And to some degree, Supernatural, like most serialized television, is predictable. We can come back to it as something that makes sense when the rest of the world doesn't make sense.
I think the other thing we see with some of those hobbies is that they bring Sam and Dean back to an earlier time that well, in their life wasn't struggle free, but it was certainly less of a struggle than going up against God and the end of the world. And, you know, Dean talks about how in all the crappy motels that John ever left them in, Scooby-Doo was always playing. And he could watch Scooby-Doo, again, solving mysteries, saving people, and it was always there. Even with the monster movies, once you've watched them and you know how it goes, watching it again isn't scary. It's familiar. And the comic books that Dean is a fan of. And obviously he's been slipping in some Disney movies because he's a Dory fan and he's not going to apologize for loving that fish. So, but those are all, you know, what are the guys who saved the world doing watching Disney movies and Scooby? Well, saving their sanity at the same time, because I know for me, if I go back and I watch the cartoons that I grew up on, I'm not dealing with grown-up problems for that half hour or 45 minutes. It doesn't make it go away, but I'm not thinking about it right now. And sometimes just that breathing space is precious. It's finite, but wow, just to get that much of a break is great.
And I think that's also one thing we can see with Dean working on Baby. Now, I come from a very car restorative family, and that's what my dad does for his de-stress. And one of the reasons that I know that my dad likes to restore the cars is because there is a finite answer. So if the fuel is not getting to the engine, there is a reason, and there is a findable, fixable reason. And you know, that's not a luxury that we can have in, you know, our daily lives, or you know, hunting a new type of monster, you know, how do we kill a Leviathan or anything like that. That set answer only can exist in Dean's mind, perhaps, in fixing Baby. You know, the engine doesn't start, it's going to be one of these 5 reasons, or windows don't go down, here's why. And he can fix it. And he gotta, I guess, gets that dopamine rush like we all do when we do get to the end of a very complicated problem. And so then we can, you know, take that little win with us when we go up against the God apocalypse in our own lives.
Yeah, and I think there is also something to be said for shifting from brain to hands when that break is needed. Working on a car is a very physical, hands-on thing. Yes, your mind needs to know how the car works, but when you're under the car, you're using your hands. It's a body thing, not a mental thing in the same way. When Dean is cooking dinner, you know, when he's cleaning the guns, all of those things, when Sam is running, it's a body thing, not a mind thing. And having those ways to switch off the brain, especially when we kind of get in that doom loop and we get the repetitive thoughts and we get all the we can't shake what's bothering us. Doing something with your hands is a great way to break that cycle. So I think we see them do that quite a bit, even if they aren't really realizing that's why they're doing what they're doing at the moment. Any other thoughts on that? On any of the things we've talked about? Okay. Well, final thoughts for anybody who feels like they're facing their own apocalypse that we can learn from Supernatural. Michelle?
Take what you've already learned. Take your previous experiences and look for the lessons that you can find within them. And also look for your allies and ask for your allies' advice, and the allies, you know, have them look into their own experiences and how you all can come together and hopefully solve your own apocalypse.
Okay. Travis?
Slow down. not everything is super time sensitive. Even in the boys, when they're looking for Lucifer, they take months. It's gonna happen in Detroit in 4 months. Slow down. Very few things are end of the world in our lives today. And we can slow down, get some help. It definitely can be there, and you can solve it.
Okay, Kaela.
I want to put in a plug for participatory fandom and doing things like fanfic and fan art in ways that we can not only relate to the characters, but also be transformative in that about our own experiences. Like, for example, I'm going through some grief stuff with somebody in my life, and I'm writing fanfic about it because it's easier to talk about how Dean would experience grief, and that allows me to have a moment of slowing down and experiencing that grief instead of being in the kind of, what Travis was alluding to, of needing to slow down, of like that grief for me is very tied up in also having to make a lot of decisions. And that ability to slow down sometimes can be found through the things that we do as part of fandom as well.
I think that's a great point, because whether it is having that feeling of being with your people that can come from being at a convention, or just hanging out with a group of friends who like to watch episodes together, it's not you against the whole world. You have this little insulation of a group of people who are seeing things through the same lens. And the transformative value of the fandom art and fiction. There are so many times in fan fiction you'll see that one or the other of the boys is dealing with some kind of illness or some kind of accident or injury. And, yes, it's a plot device, but I'm betting that, a fair number of times that author has gone through that or is going through something similar. And by writing it into the story for the heroes to deal with, it's again empowering, because Sam and Dean can get through this. So, now I have a little more faith, which really comes down to the core of the show. Always keep fighting. So thank you so much for being with me today. This has been wonderful. Let's go around and let everybody know where we can find you online. Michelle?
You can find me on Twitter at preheating prof.
Okay, Travis?
Just on panels like this. Sometimes I'm on panels at your local comic conventions and things like that.
Okay, Kaela?
Also on panels, I also have a book out, Fandom Acts of Kindness, Guide to Activism, Advocacy, and Doing Chaotic Good. You can find that at all major retailers.
And I'm pretty easy to find at gailzmartin.com, morganbryce.com. If you spell them right, you'll find me on all the major social media. So thank you so much for being wonderful panelists with us today. And thanks to all of you for watching and listening. There will be more Supernatural coming up soon, so we'll see you online.